Now let's talk about another psychological state, which is a neurological rather than psychological state. And this is the strange case that certain people with temporal lobe epilepsy can become what neurologists refer to as hyper-religious, which I will describe as having high levels of fervor and having very frequent experiences of awe. And you can look up videos of people with temporal lobe epilepsy, and it's very interesting. So here are a group of people that it has been claimed that they suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy. Actually, this type of epilepsy, which was discovered in the 70s mostly, but initially was referred to as Dostoevsky's epilepsy because Dostoevsky describes many of the symptoms in the book, The Idiot. And it was weird to neurologists to see that collection of symptoms. He shouldn't have been able to know that those will come together. But it seems like he suffered from it, especially later in his life. But people like Edgar Allan Poe, philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, which there's a great paper which document very, very convincingly. Vincent van Gogh has been claimed. Ellen G. White, who is the leader of the Seventh-day Adventists, and she is described as having got hit in the side of the head at one point, and from then on write a lot of text and become very fervent. And it seems very plausible that she suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy. And then we have Ayn Rand and L. Ron Hubbard, which I am certain suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy. But of course, this is all armchair diagnostics. This is not legitimate form of practicing medicine. This is not an actual diagnosis. Never met any of those people. But even though it is illegitimate medically, I do think that it's pretty convincing, the evidence looking at their lives and at their behavior, that they suffered from this horrible neurological condition. So let's talk about what is epilepsy in general. So epilepsy is a neurological condition where a person can suffer from seizures that emanate from a focal point, which can be a blood clot or a scar or some kind of brain abnormality, which you can be born with or you can get later in life. But from that focal, you can have recurring seizures. And seizures are like electrical storms in the brain. Now, when these storms spread throughout the brain, then you can have generalized epilepsy. You can have what's called grand mal seizures. And those are seizures that result in people shaking on the floor, and the famous, what looks like an epileptic seizure and described in the media. But not all epilepsy comes with grand mal seizures. So many times the seizures remain localized in a certain part of the brain. In those cases, we don't see grand mal seizures, but the person is still epileptic and is still having seizures. So the location of the seizure hotspot in the brain determines a lot about what kind of epilepsy and what kind of seizures the person will have and what kind of experiences. So it makes a big difference. So it is a very small minority of epileptics that are temporal lobe epileptics. So if we see what causes epilepsy, it can be all sorts of things. It can be stroke, brain tumor, an infection like encephalitis, brain injury, loss of oxygen, as you can see, certain genetic conditions, neurological conditions, and alcohol withdrawal. But you can become epileptic in the middle of your life. So unlike other psychiatric conditions that a person would have throughout their lives, with epilepsy we can see people and compare how they were before they were epileptic and after, which is something you can't do with autism, which makes it very interesting. Now, epilepsy is not described in the DSM, the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual, which is a problem. There are people who suffer from epilepsy and it looks like a mental condition. They go to get help, they go to a psychologist, they go to a psychiatrist, but the problem is neurological. It's not psychiatric. Now, the reason why epilepsy is not in the DSM, which is the Bible of psychiatry, is because the DSM is a diagnostics manual. And epilepsy, you usually diagnose with EEG or an MRI. So you do an actual brain scan to look for epilepsy. So as such, it's not part of the DSM. Let's talk about this interesting epilepsy that can make people display high levels of fervor. This is the temporal lobe. It's here on the side. And recently, people have been talking about these symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy. They can emanate both from the temporal lobe or from the insular lobe, which is a lobe that's hidden behind over here, but they're very closely, there's a big highway that connects the insular lobe and the temporal lobe. The insular lobe is a lobe that we know a lot less than all the rest because it's hard to reach it, so you can't probe it by removing parts of a person's skull and seeing the effects. But it seems like insular lobe can also display the symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy. An important thing about the temporal lobe is that there are parts of the midbrain that are located inside the temporal lobe. So these organs are not lobes, they're not part of the cortex, but they're more ancient parts of the brain. But this part extends into the temporal lobe, and in the middle of it, we have organs like the amygdala, like the hippocampus, and things that are related to emotional experiences and emotional learning. Okay, so let's see what are the functions associated with the temporal lobe. And here, of course, we have to say that it's not like these things happen in the temporal lobe, because these are things that are associated the temporal lobe. So damage to the temporal lobe affects them and things like that. But you cannot say that there is a one-to-one brain region to brain function correlation. So I'm not making that argument, but still there are very interesting things that are related with the temporal lobe. And looking at these things that are associated with the temporal lobe can help us possibly understand why they're also related to awe and to fervor. So awe experiences, as we'll see, have elements that are related to this. So for example, if we look at the sense of hearing, this is part of the temporal lobe, right? It's also on the sides of the brain by the ears. And we know that historically, that proselytizing and changing people's minds and creating religious and political fervor, many times it is very effective using audio. So political radio can induce higher levels of fervor. Many religious conversion, proselytizing happens on radio or using audio tapes. And that can be related to the fact that awe and the feeling of knowing that is related to awe, this feeling of the really real, is connected to the same part of the brain or is associated with the same part of the brain where hearing happens. And if we look at the golden age of radio, where radio was much more prevalent form of communication, we see that this was a time of very high levels of political fervor and people who felt very strongly about their political ideas. We've had the most popular American president at the golden age of radio. We also see that people who hear voices can see those hallucinations as authoritative. So many times when people hallucinate a vision and they see something that doesn't exist, they know that it's not there. So they see something and they say, oh my God, I'm seeing something that I'm having a vision. But people who hear voices are more likely to judge those voices to be real and authoritative and that they have to obey those voices. So this sense of hearing is much more closer to authority and the feeling of realness. In the Bible, there are many, many prophets that hear God, but very few prophets see God, and even that is disputed, whether they see him or not. Just Ezekiel and Moses, but all the rest here, hearing voices is a lot more common. We also see that music can affect us emotionally very directly in a way that visual art can also affect us, but it requires more intellectualization for us to be overcome with awe from a visual thing. With audio, it can sometimes be more direct and more overwhelming regardless. Okay, so then there's smelling, tasting, and then there's the vestibular sense and also the proprioceptive sense. So the vestibular sense is related to balance and motion and the assessment of things in the spatial world. So things like assessing of size or those kind of things are related to this part of the brain and the vestibular organs. So, for example, when people have awe experiences, many times those experiences have a vestibular aspect. So they feel like they're floating, they feel like they're lighter. Many people lose their balance. So, for example, this person over here, he might be having a very strong awe experience, but because of the awe experience having a vestibular aspect to it, it messes up with the regular balance. And so some people will have to lie down or to sit down because when they're overwhelmed with the awe experience, they lose their balance. We see that when people in Pentecostal churches, many times they will lose their balance as they are being slain by the Spirit. And you can have out-of-body experiences where you feel like you're floating, but even without out-of-body experiences, you can have a feeling that you're lighter, you're walking on air, you're overcome with awe, and you feel there's a vestibular aspect to the experience. We also see that many people manipulate their vestibular sense to either induce or amplify an awe experience. So there's people who would spin or sway or dance or Devon, which is moving like that. But we see a lot of vestibular manipulation as part of rituals that are intended to induce awe experiences. And then there's vastness. So vastness can many times be felt as an aspect of an awe experience. Vastness can also cause an awe experience, but it can also be the product of awe experiences. For example, a person can go to a concert, sit listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and have an experience that they describe as being connected to the universe or to infinity, or they felt like they have expanded, or that they have, so they'll have maybe both a vestibular but also a sense of vastness. It can be abstract vastness. But that is vastness that's the product, or that is an aspect of an awe experience. But in this case, this diver might have seen this vast whale and be overcome with awe because the vastness induced the awe. Or a grand church, or seeing the night sky and thinking about the size of the galaxy, or that we're made of tens of trillions of cells and each one of them is more complicated than the solar system. And you can start thinking about vastness related things and induce an awe experience. And we also see that many times things that are related to awe are described using terms and using metaphors and symbols that are connected to the vestibular sense. So, for example, Jesus rising and floating, or gods that are floating in the sky, or angels that are floating, or heaven is up in the sky. The heavenly bodies which are floating, they don't fall down like regular objects, and things like fire and light which defy gravity. So they give us this vestibular feeling when we look at them because of their floating nature. Okay, so I've been describing the connection between the vestibular as well as proprioceptive senses and awe experiences. But if we go back, we can see that there's many other things that are related to the temporal lobe. It's also sometimes the edges of the temporal lobe where it connects to the parietal lobe. And we can see that there's the feelings of knowing, which we'll talk about. These are things like certainty or familiarity or conviction, and we'll talk about them in particular, but they're very, very important. There's all sorts of emotion-related things that are near the temporal lobe, dreaming, memory and learning, language, and as well as literacy. As we will see, one of the symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy is writing a lot of text, if the epileptic focus is on the same side of the brain where you write, especially. Okay, so here is a list of symptoms called the Baer-Fedio inventory. These are personality traits that are more likely to occur in people who suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy. So we'll go through them. You'll see that many of these traits are traits that are more typical of cult leaders, which also would have high fervor, than they would with cult followers, even though some of them are also seen in high fervor individuals who are followers, who are not the leaders. And there's various ways for this relationship to exist. It could be that the cult followers are imitating a leader that behaves like this. It could be that temporal lobe epilepsy makes you feel awe all the time, and then it comes with these traits. And if you induce awe in you all the time in other methods, even though you don't have an actual epilepsy, because you induce the awe all the time, you will get some of these traits as well. So it's unclear. There's more research can be done to assess that. But what we see here is there's all sorts of emotionality, elation, but also sadness, anger, aggression. There's altered sexual interest. Many times people with temporal lobe epilepsy have a lower libido, but also sometimes strange. As we'll see here in the elation and euphoria, we have here diagnosis of manic depressive disease and diagnosis of depression. So this is neurologists telling you that a psychologist or psychiatrist will diagnose this as bipolar, but it's not. So a symptom of temporal lobe epilepsy is a diagnosis of manic depressive, or what today we call bipolar disorder. And then we have, this guilt is surprisingly there. There's hypermoralism. And hypermoralism, it's described here as attention to rules with inability to distinguish significant minor infractions and a desire to punish offenders, which is this kind of black and white thinking that is typical of high fervor people. We see that a lot in cults, for example. There is obsessionalism, and we'll see that also with the viscosity. There's a tendency for repetition. It's ritualism, orderliness, but a lot of times we see repetitive behavior in temporal lobe epileptics. The circumstantiality refers to people who speak about things that are peripheral, as they say, the people who focus not on what you want to talk to them about. They keep on focusing on other things. There's what they call in viscosity stickiness and tendency for repetition. And in the article, they describe this as when you go to town and a cult member tries to talk to you, tries to convert you to bring you into their group. Many people do not want to interact with them because they're afraid that if they'll start talking to them, they will not be able to get rid of them because they will have this stickiness and they will not change the conversation when you cue that you want to change it to something else. They will not get that. So that is a symptom of temporal lobe epilepsy, which you can get in the middle of your life. There's a sense of personal destiny, which in the case of high levels of fervor, many times that is felt collectively. It would be a sense of collective destiny or personal destiny as part of a group. So the group is destined to something or other, but with temporal lobe epilepsy, many times people feel that they themselves, and events given highly charged significance. So this can manifest as what's referred to, I think, as ideas of reference, where you think that what you do at home affects the news, for example. So if I take this sip of water, this could have effect on world affairs, or if I didn't drink that water. So that kind of thinking that everything you do is relevant. The next one here is hypergraphia, which is writing a whole lot of text. So that is something that is typical more of leaders than it is of cult members. But we see there's religiosity, philosophical interest, there's dependence and passivity, and there's humorlessness, sobriety, and finally the last one is paranoia, which is of course a very, very sad part of this condition. Because of the paranoia, a lot of people are afraid to have it treated, or for example, L. Ron Hubbard might have neglected his health because of paranoia, fear of doctors. So many people neglect this condition, and it can be very sad, very, very difficult. Okay, so we're done talking about temporal lobe epilepsy and its relation to fervor. And again, this is a rare neurological condition that allows us to get information about what fervor is like, but it's not, fervor is not. People with high levels of fervor are not epileptic. It's not. But the next psychological state is the states of mania or hypomania. Now, in the case of actual mania or hypomania, these are by definition part of bipolar disorder, what used to be called manic depressive disorder. But there are states that display symptoms of mania or hypomania without actually being part of bipolar disorder. Let's look at some of the symptoms of mania and hypomania. So we have a grandiosity, racing thoughts, talking rapidly, being highly distractible, feeling unusually optimistic or extremely irritable, sleeping very little, and acting recklessly and impulsively. So the difference between mania and hypomania is that in addition to all of these symptoms, in the case of actual mania, there are many times delusional or psychotic elements, while in hypomania you do not have those. Now, a big difference between the state of fervor and the state of mania is a state or hypomania is that hypomania tends to be very positive and optimistic. And even though you might be ruining your life in this state because you're acting recklessly and impulsively, you're very optimistic throughout the whole process. And in the case of both limerence and fervor, we see many times that people can alternate very rapidly between very positive and very negative emotions regarding their state. So a person who is romantically infatuated might be ecstatic when they think there's going to be reciprocation, or they might be absolutely distressed when they think that the person they're in love might be in love with someone else. But it does seem like the onset of limerence and the onset of fervor do seem like hypomanic states, which is both good because it feels good, but bad because you can be recklessly and impulsively, and you can commit to things that you might not have committed if you were not in this state. There is a study that compared adolescents who are in the early stages of limerence, who have recently fallen in love at first sight romantically, and comparing their psychological state with hypomania, and the conclusion was that it does seem to resemble, but even though it requires more research. So there is reasons to believe that the onset of the psychological state might include elements that are seen in mania or more hypomania. Now, what triggers both hypomania and mania in bipolar people who suffer from bipolar disorder is both high levels of stress, but also stress removal. Now, there is a PhD I recently read by a fellow called Hunter from South Africa, where he very convincingly argues that large group awareness training organizations, LGATs, such as the Forum, Landmark Forum, and others, that they stress people for a few days and then they do a sudden stress removal. And the stress includes sleep deprivation, etc. And that at the end of those days, people display hypomanic symptoms. And it's this combination of both stress, but then the stress removal, which can induce hypomanic state. And it might be curious as to why both stress and stress removal, both positive and very negative things, can both induce, in this case, hypomania, but this could be the onset of a state of fervor in some cases. And it might make more sense if we think about love such as parental love, but other forms of love, where both a negative event, such as a child getting injured, can increase a person's levels of infatuation with their child, but also the child winning an award can increase infatuation. So we can see that both positive and negative emotional experiences regarding your target can increase infatuation. In this case, they can both cause hypomanic symptoms, but as we'll see later, that will play a role in the induction of awe and the way awe comes about. So we went through 3 different psychological states. Love is, I think, a much closer relative to the state of fervor. It has a lot more in common with it. Temporal lobe epilepsy, of course, is a neurological condition, so it's not strictly a psychological state, but it does give us insights into aspects of the experiences and the state that might come about. And we have mania or hypomania, which can be seen in the early onset of the state of fervor, that you get symptoms that resemble mania. So now let's get to the emotional experiences of awe. And I'll get to a quote by great William James. This is from the Varieties of Religious Experiences, where James describes mystical experiences, saying that they have a noetic quality. The word noetic relates to knowledge. And he says that the noetic quality, although so similar to states of feeling, mystical states seems to those who experience them to be also states of knowledge. They are illuminations, revelations, full of significance and importance, and as a rule, they carry with them a curious sense of authority for aftertime. So we see here that states of feeling, which are a subjective state, are treated as states of knowledge, which is an objective, a feeling that something is objective. And as such, the mystical experiences can be said to be part of the feelings of knowing. But he talks about mystical experiences here, but if we look at other experiences, for example, sudden falling in love experiences, we see that they also can be similar to states of feeling, but seem to be states of knowledge. And they are also full of significance, and they carry authority for aftertime. So when Romeo and Juliet fall in love with each other, they have a state of feeling, but they feel as if it is a state of knowledge, that they know that they belong with each other, right? So they have this, it's a subjective feeling, or it's subjective that something is objective. And I will try to talk objectively about subjective feelings that feel like something is objective. So let's see what they are. So awe is the name of the emotion, but it also includes other terms like wonder, mystery, astonishment, horror, and others. And horror seems out of place here, but historically, up until about 200 years ago, 150 years ago, horror was closely associated with awe, and religious people refer to it as God-fearing. And there's different theories about why that happened then, and I could go into it, but not here. So we talked about the feelings of knowing, and they were mentioned earlier as something that's associated with the temporal lobe, and something that's also associated with love. And some of my discussion would concern the book On Being Certain by Robert Burton. Highly recommend that book. And he describes the feelings of knowing, which, as I said, are subjective feelings that something is objective. And the difference in the feelings of knowing is the difference between how you feel regarding a true story and how you feel regarding just a story where you don't think it's true. And so the feelings of knowing color the whole story in a way, you could say, in this case. Now, examples of feelings of knowing can be seen in epiphanies or like a eureka moment where you got an insight. There's gut feelings where you feel something is right. And also, feelings of knowing play a role in depression, where in depression, people not only feel as whatever the negative thing that is a part of their depression, but they feel that it is really real. So it's not just they have a feeling that they're whatever, a failure, but they feel that that is really real. And so that is an aspect of what makes depression so horrible. There's also the feelings of not knowing. For example, when someone has a crisis of faith, or when someone has skepticism, which can be healthy or unhealthy skepticism. And we can learn a lot about the feelings of knowing from when they glitch, when they mess up. So just like optical illusions, where our sense of vision can act up, and that teaches us a lot about vision, seeing when the feelings of knowing mess up can teach us about the feelings of knowing. So for example, déjà vu, which is an inappropriate feeling of familiarity, is an example of the feeling of knowing. And déjà vu is a symptom of temporal lobe epilepsy. So people with temporal lobe epilepsy many times can have déjà vu. They can have it for days at a time. And those are days where they are seizing, they're having a seizure that lasts for days or weeks. Jamais vu is the inappropriate feeling of unfamiliarity, where you go to place where should be familiar, but it's not familiar, doesn't feel familiar. There's the tip of the tongue sensation, where you know that you know something, but you don't know what it is that you know. But you feel like you will know soon what it is that you know, but at that moment you don't know. There's misidentification syndrome, where people can, for example, have brain trauma, come back from the hospital and feel everything is the same except that my mother is an imposter. She looks the same, she talks the same, she's got the same everything, knowledge. But because those people do not have the feeling of knowing, in this case familiarity, they feel as if their mother is an imposter, or that they can think that an object was replaced. When they left, this table was replaced by another one that looks like it. And it can be very tragic. There's pathological doubt, which can be seen in, for example, in obsessive compulsive disorder, where there's people who can never feel as if they locked the door or turned off the stove. And so they check it and recheck it and recheck it because they have pathological doubt. And there's a thing called Cotard's delusion, where people are convinced that they are dead. And when confronted with this strange belief that they have that they are dead, many times Burton describes, I think in this book, but maybe another book, talking to someone suffering from Cotard syndrome, which is also something that can happen to people with temporal lobe epilepsy, and asking them, so you're dead. And they say, yes, I am dead. So would you mind feeling your pulse? Do you feel a pulse? And they say, yeah, I do feel a pulse. And they say, so what does that mean? Says, that means that dead people can have a pulse. So we see that when the feelings of knowing interact or conflict with logic, the feelings of knowing win out. So a person will give an excuse that would justify their feelings of knowing, like dead men have pulses. Okay, so let's look at some of the specific feelings of knowing. We have a feeling of familiarity, certainty, conviction, and right and wrong. And the difference between certainty and conviction is that certainty, you might have never learned something that you are certain of. For example, you might not remember when you learned that 1 + 2 = 3, but you're convinced that it's true. While conviction, it's something like one day you learn that the capital of Canada is Ottawa, and you have a strong conviction regarding it, but it is something that you acquired at some point in your life. And then there's right and wrong, right? Or correct and incorrect. And animals that have theory of mind, which theory of mind is not a theory, it is an ability, and theory of mind is when an animal knows that another animal also has a mind. So when that chimpanzee knows that the other chimpanzee might be wrong about something, right? So when they have that ability, theory of mind, which certain animals have, then they will have an additional feeling of knowing of realness and fakeness. So they might suspect that message that the other one is saying, he might be faking it. Okay, so that's an additional feeling of knowing. Now, in humans who have symbolic language, there's yet another feeling of knowing, which is true versus false or true versus lie. And for that, you need symbolic language for a full truth and falsehood. Now, when it comes to the feeling of knowings that are associated with love, when it comes to love, the feelings of knowing can become feelings of great knowledge or feeling that something is really real. So, for example, in the case of romantic love, the people who are in a limerent state can feel that they are meant for each other, and this is felt as really real, not as ordinarily real. And in the case of parental love, there is a story which I read somewhere, but I don't remember where it's from. So if you know where it's from, write it in the comments. And it's a story of a group of parents of couples that go to China to adopt babies. So they go to the orphanage, they stand in line, each one of them in turn receives a baby, and then they go back to the hotel. And the next morning over breakfast, they meet and they say that the woman that was handing out the babies, she was a genius, because she knew exactly which baby to give to each parent. Now the thing is that they all know that the babies were handed out randomly, but because they cannot imagine loving another baby as much as they love the baby that they received, it feels to them as if this baby and them were meant for each other. And so there's a feeling of knowing, a feeling that this is really real. And they jokingly say that the lady handing him out was a genius, because how they feel. Okay, so what we see is that love adds a special aspect to the feeling of knowing. So if we have a mother cat, for example, she might have regular familiarity with a neighbor's dog, but special familiarity with her kittens. She might have certainty regarding her role with raising those kittens. And when she feels that her kittens are doing something wrong, that she corrects them. But the feelings of knowing become special when they interact with love, in this case parental love. And when it comes to awe can make all the various feelings of knowing have a special aspect to them, which is why with awe and with fervor, you can have situations where people feel that what they feel awe towards or what they have fervor towards is somehow really real, that it's not ordinary reality, but it's ultimate reality. Now, because of this, you can have a situation where the same awe experience can simultaneously validate the truth value of a set of ideas in a book, validate whatever a preacher might say, which might contradict the content of the book, and a certain way of life. So if we see, for example, a Christian who believes in the prosperity gospel, they can have a very strong awe experience, which will prove to them that the Bible is true, with its message that they must give all their money to the poor, and that their preacher is true, with the message that they need to make as much money as they can. and the way of life. But because of the awe experience, the feeling of knowing, and the blind spots that come with it, many times people would not see any of the contradictions. So I said before how someone can believe with all their heart in a set of ideas that they don't know what they are, right? So they can believe that whatever is in that book, I believe, but I don't know what's in the book. But now I'm also saying that you can also ignore the central things in that book, even though you know them and very familiar with them. So you can, as part of your true belief, believe that God will take care of your sustenance. God will provide, even if you don't. Now, you must never act on that belief, because that might not end well. But so at the same time, you can believe in something that you don't know what it is, and you can completely ignore the central aspects of your beliefs because of the nature of awe and the feelings of knowing.